No one notices when an empath starts changing because the shift is quiet and almost invisible, like a slow fading light that nobody thinks to question until the room feels noticeably colder than it used to. By that point, it already becomes hard to find the exact moment when things started to change. There is no single clear event that explains it. Instead, it feels like something gradual slipping away in the background while life continues normally. People assume everything is the same because nothing obvious looks broken, but the emotional atmosphere is no longer what it was before. It was never just one moment that caused the change. It was a pattern that built over time, made up of small emotional cuts that never seemed serious on their own. Each one felt minor, easy to ignore, easy to explain away. But together they started building weight beneath the surface. This is the part most people fail to notice. Emotional damage does not always come from big events. It often comes from repetition, from things that seem small but keep happening again and again until they slowly reshape how a person feels inside, without them even realizing it clearly at first. Empaths do not usually explode when they are hurt. They do not create loud arguments or demand immediate attention in dramatic ways. Instead, they withdraw in a quieter form. They start disappearing in pieces, slowly pulling back parts of themselves without announcing it to anyone. What remains on the outside still looks calm, polite, and emotionally present, but internally something is no longer the same. It is not a sudden break. It is a gradual retreat from emotional openness, where they start conserving energy instead of freely giving it as they once did. From the outside, many people do not notice anything different at all. The empath still shows up, still listens, still responds, and still behaves in ways that seem caring and engaged. That is why the change often goes unnoticed for so long. People assume presence means everything is fine, but internally something important has already started shifting. The emotional availability is not what it used to be. Even while they continue functioning socially, there is a growing sense of distance forming inside them that others cannot easily see or understand. Empaths become skilled at hiding their pain because it is something they learn to do over time. They do not want to burden others or create discomfort, so they continue showing up even when they feel emotionally drained. They keep listening, keep caring, and keep responding in ways that appear normal. But internally, something begins to change at a deeper level. Their emotional system starts adjusting itself quietly. What they feel is no longer fully expressed, and what they give starts to reduce slowly without them consciously deciding it all at once. This is where things become deeper than what most people usually talk about. Repeated emotional hurt does not only create distance between people, it actually starts changing how an empath processes trust, relationships, and even their own self-perception. It is not just about becoming tired. It is about internal restructuring. The mind begins to reassess what is safe and what is not. Over time, emotional responses become more controlled, more careful, and more selective, not because feelings disappear, but because they start being filtered differently than before. This transformation is not loud or dramatic like it is often shown in movies or stories. It is subtle, controlled, and very easy to misunderstand. There are no big visible breakdowns in most cases. Instead, there is a quiet internal adjustment happening in the background. This is why it carries such a lasting impact. People around them may still think everything is normal, while in reality, the empath has already started experiencing emotional shifts that slowly change how they connect, react, and engage with others on a deeper level. In this process, you start to see why empaths begin to go silent instead of speaking up. It is not because they have nothing to say, but because speaking up no longer feels as safe or effective as it once did. You also begin to understand why they start questioning themselves even when they did nothing wrong. Their mind becomes trained to look inward first, trying to find fault in themselves to make sense of repeated emotional discomfort. And eventually, you see why they stop giving the same energy they once gave freely. Each of these changes has a reason behind it. Nothing happens randomly. There is a deeper emotional process taking place that most people never really notice. The shift is not about becoming less caring, but about becoming more protective of their own emotional stability. When empathy is repeatedly met with imbalance or hurt, the mind naturally starts creating boundaries, even if they are not spoken out loud. These boundaries slowly reshape how much they give, how openly they trust, and how deeply they allow themselves to be affected. What often looks like distance from the outside is actually protection forming from the inside. What appears as emotional coldness is usually exhaustion that has built up over time. And what seems like indifference is often the result of caring too deeply for too long without receiving the same level of emotional return. These changes are not intentional in a harsh sense. They are adaptive responses that develop quietly as a way to prevent further emotional overload in situations that have already felt draining. One of the lesser known truths about empaths is that repeated emotional pain does not simply make them weaker or less sensitive. Instead, it makes them more aware of patterns, energy, and emotional imbalance. But this awareness does not come without a cost. It changes how they respond, what they accept, and how quickly they step back when something feels emotionally unsafe. Over time, their emotional boundaries become stronger, but their openness becomes more selective. This entire process does not happen overnight. It builds layer by layer, experience by experience, until one day the change becomes noticeable in their behavior. By then, they are no longer responding in the same way they used to. Their silence, their distance, and their reduced emotional output are not signs of emptiness. They are signs of accumulated emotional experience shaping how they choose to protect themselves going forward. Their presence feels different, and their silence starts saying more than their words ever did. Many people misunderstand this phase because from the outside it looks sudden, like the empath has simply become distant without any clear reason. But what they do not see is the long history behind that shift. It is made up of repeated moments where the empath chose to stay quiet, chose to forgive, chose to understand, even when it was not easy. Over time, understanding slowly turns into emotional fatigue, and that fatigue slowly turns into detachment, and that detachment becomes a way of protecting themselves from being hurt in the same way again. The truth is, once this process reaches a certain level, it is not easy to reverse. The empath is no longer reacting purely from emotion alone. They are reacting from experience, from memory, from patterns they have already lived through. That changes everything about how they engage with people. Their responses become more careful, more controlled, and more measured. They are no longer simply feeling in the moment. They are also remembering what similar moments have cost them in the past, and that awareness quietly shapes their behavior. As this transformation continues, the empath starts operating from a different internal place. It is no longer just openness and emotional flow. It becomes a mix of feeling and caution. They still care, but they are no longer unguarded. Their trust is no longer automatic. It is earned slowly, and even then, it is constantly being evaluated in the background. This does not mean they have become cold. It means they have become more aware of emotional consequences and less willing to ignore patterns that once hurt them repeatedly without resolution. Many people around them do not recognize this shift because the surface behavior still looks familiar. The empath still shows kindness, still listens, still shows patience. But internally, something has changed in how freely that energy is given. What used to flow naturally now feels more controlled. There is more hesitation before giving, more observation before opening up, more internal checking before reacting. It is a quiet restructuring of how they relate to emotional exchange. And this is exactly where misunderstanding often begins. From the outside, everything still appears like kindness and patience. But on the inside, it feels heavier and more calculated. The emotional effort is no longer effortless. It is now something they manage carefully so they do not end up overextending themselves again. This shift does not happen all at once. It develops slowly through repeated experiences where their emotional effort was not matched, not acknowledged, or not protected. It starts with small everyday moments that seem insignificant at first. Moments where they give more than they receive, where they listen without being truly heard, where they try to explain themselves but end up misunderstood, and where they choose silence instead of conflict just to maintain peace. Each of these moments may feel small in isolation, but emotionally they do not disappear. They stay inside, quietly building up over time in ways that are not immediately visible to others. This is where the cycle begins to form. Empaths are not quick to walk away from people. They tend to stay longer than most, try harder than most, and believe in understanding even when it becomes emotionally costly. Because of this, they often find themselves in situations where their effort becomes expected rather than appreciated. Not always out of intentional harm, but often out of habit. When someone consistently gives without limits, people around them begin to assume that level of giving will always be there. Instead of breaking that pattern, empaths usually adjust themselves. They start lowering their own needs without even fully realizing it. They begin silencing their discomfort. They convince themselves that things are temporary, that it will improve, or that maybe they are overthinking the situation. Over time, this repeated self-adjustment becomes a quiet form of emotional self-neglect. It does not happen loudly. It builds slowly, layer by layer, until their internal balance starts to shift. Eventually, something inside begins to resist. It is not a sudden reaction or dramatic breaking point. It is more like a quiet internal questioning that starts to appear in the background. They begin to wonder why the effort feels one-sided, why understanding is not being returned in the same way, and why their emotional energy seems to go further in one direction than the other. These thoughts do not arrive all at once. They come in pieces through repeated experiences that start to form a pattern too consistent to ignore. This is where the internal shift truly begins. The empath starts to feel the weight of everything they have been carrying for so long, but instead of expressing it outwardly, they begin to change inwardly. One of the first noticeable signs of this change is emotional numbing. This does not mean they have stopped feeling. It means they have been feeling too much for too long without relief, and the mind begins to protect itself in the only way it can. That protection comes in the form of reducing emotional intensity. It creates distance between what is felt and what is shown. On the surface, this can look like calmness, composure, or even indifference. But internally, emotions are still present. They are just no longer expressed in the same open and unfiltered way. They are held back, managed, and filtered before being shown to the outside world. This is where people often misunderstand what is happening. They assume the feelings are gone or that the empath no longer cares. In reality, the emotions are still there, but they are no longer freely accessible in the same way. They have been placed behind internal boundaries created through experience. The empath still feels deeply, but now they also think carefully before allowing those feelings to guide their actions, because they have learned that feeling without limits can sometimes come at a personal cost. And this shift leads into another layer, one that is even more complex: overthinking and self-doubt. Because even after being hurt, the empath does not immediately turn outward and blame others. Instead, they turn inward first. They question themselves. They replay conversations again and again in their mind. They go over their own words, their tone, their reactions, and even small expressions, wondering if they said something wrong, if they misunderstood the situation, or if they overreacted without realizing it. This habit of self-questioning becomes automatic over time, almost like a reflex that happens without effort. This constant internal review creates a loop that is very hard to break. The more they think, the more possible explanations they generate. And the more explanations they create, the harder it becomes to trust their own perception of what actually happened. Their mind stops feeling like a clear source of truth and starts feeling like something uncertain that needs constant checking. This is where emotional exhaustion deepens further, because they are not only dealing with what happened in reality, but also with the endless mental reconstruction of it inside their own thoughts. Trying to find clarity in something that may never have been clear to begin with becomes a draining process. It takes energy to analyze, to question, to reanalyze, and to doubt again. Over time, this leads to a quiet kind of withdrawal. It does not happen in a sudden or noticeable way. There is no announcement or clear explanation. It is simply felt in the way they start to pull back from emotional involvement little by little without fully explaining it to others or sometimes even to themselves. They begin to share less than before. They explain their feelings in fewer words. They stop trying as hard to make others understand every detail of their emotional experience because they slowly learn that not everyone is willing or able to engage at that depth. This realization does not come from one moment. It comes from many small experiences where they felt unheard, misunderstood, or emotionally unmatched. And each of those experiences adds another layer of hesitation. This is where silence starts to carry meaning. It is no longer just a way to avoid conflict or keep peace in the moment. It becomes something deeper, a form of emotional protection. It is a way to conserve internal energy, to avoid repeating cycles that have already led to emotional exhaustion in the past. Silence becomes less about avoidance and more about preservation. It is a quiet decision to not overextend themselves in situations that no longer feel emotionally balanced. Because of this gradual shift, when an empath eventually leaves a situation or relationship, it rarely looks dramatic from the outside. There is no sudden breaking point that is obvious to everyone. Instead, it looks like distance forming slowly. It looks like less communication, less emotional availability, less presence in small, everyday ways. The exit happens in stages, almost invisibly, until their presence fades without a single clear moment of departure that others can easily point to. The truth behind this pattern is simple but often missed. They do not leave loudly or abruptly in most cases. They leave quietly, piece by piece, long before anyone realizes it is happening. By the time others notice the distance, the emotional exit has already been in progress for quite some time. What people see at the end is only the final stage of something that has been building slowly underneath the surface for a long period of time. As this emotional detachment continues to develop, another important change begins to form: boundaries. These are not always present from the beginning in a clear or structured way. In the past, boundaries may have felt uncomfortable, unnecessary, or even selfish to the empath. But after repeated emotional experiences, they start to understand that boundaries are not about pushing people away. They are about protecting their own energy, their emotional stability, and their mental space. This realization changes how they interact with others. They start becoming more selective with their time and attention. They begin to notice who respects their emotional space and who takes it for granted. Not everyone is given the same level of access anymore. This is not because they care less, but because they have learned through experience that emotional energy is not something that can be endlessly given without consequence, and this shift marks a deeper turning point that affects their overall sense of self. It is not about losing who they are, but about evolving into a more aware version of themselves. They become more conscious of their emotional patterns, more careful about where they invest their energy, and more intentional in how they respond to people and situations. The version of them that once gave without hesitation is still there, but it is no longer unprotected or automatic. At first, this change can feel unfamiliar, even uncomfortable, because it is different from how they used to operate. But over time, it starts to feel necessary. It aligns with everything they have learned through experience. Their empathy does not disappear, but it becomes more refined. It is no longer uncontrolled or freely given in every direction. It becomes something they guide with awareness instead of something that simply flows without boundaries. This is where an important truth becomes clear. Empaths do not become cold or emotionally unavailable in the way people sometimes assume. Instead, they become more careful with their emotional investment. They do not stop caring about others. They simply become more selective about where that care goes and how it is expressed. Their kindness does not vanish. It becomes protected, directed, and no longer given without consideration. From the outside, this can sometimes be misunderstood as emotional distance or loss of warmth. But from the inside, it is experienced as growth and adaptation. It is a response shaped by repeated emotional lessons that required change in order to maintain balance. Over time, this creates a quieter but stronger form of emotional awareness that is deeply rooted in understanding patterns that were once overlooked. This is why the final realization carries so much weight. It changes how the entire journey is understood. The kindest people do not become heartless. They become more aware of where their kindness is placed. They learn that giving without limits is not always sustainable. They learn that understanding others should not come at the cost of completely ignoring themselves. And through this learning, they begin to build a more balanced emotional life. This does not make them less empathetic. It makes them more grounded and more aligned with their own emotional needs. Everything they go through contributes to this shift, shaping a version of them that is still caring, but no longer self-sacrificing in the same unguarded way as before. And when all of this comes together, one truth becomes clear above everything else. An empath does not simply break under emotional pressure. They adapt, they adjust, they transform. And in that transformation, they begin to stop carrying pain that was never returned with care, not out of bitterness or resentment, but out of clarity that forms slowly over time. A clarity shaped by experience, reinforced by repeated emotional patterns, and strengthened by the decision to no longer give endlessly in places where their value is not recognized. That clarity does not erase what they feel. It changes how they choose to act on it moving forward. And that shift continues quietly long after the painful experiences themselves have ended, influencing how they move through relationships, how they set emotional limits, and how they recognize their own worth in situations that once felt confusing or overwhelming.